Okay, I think you can see what I can see.
Yeah, that's great. Yes.
Great. Okay, so now I'm gonna play with this button, see if that works. Yay, okay. Now I just have to get rid of all of you. Okay, so probably the way I would frame this conversation today is just I've been an activist since I was a teenager. Um, and at each kind of stage of the process, I've been examining different parts of the legal mobilization process. Um, when I came to Kingsborough in 2010, it was right after the financial collapse in New York City, and I was mostly relieved to have any kind of a job at all. But at that time, I was really focused on that being a part-time job, um, and starting to develop I had the idea of developing a nonprofit legal practice. Um, but quickly after working at Kingsborough, um, one particular student challenged me with this question: should educators be activists? And so I think I misunderstood her. I think when she first brought this up in the classroom, and I felt almost offensive um, that perhaps I shouldn't be an activist in the educational environment. I had come to the campus with the idea that I was going to be an activist and that this was a particularly good group to work with, which I'll get into those demographics in a couple of slides. Um, but through a series of conversations, then I just opened up the classroom and we all talked about what role education plays in activism. And at that time, I think we were using the language of social justice. Uh, but a student, Jasmine, brought in this concept in relation to labeling theory that she was learning in Intro to Criminal Justice. Um, and this was the quote that I actually use in a anthology that we put together with students. And I was, this was hard for me to grasp at first, but then through this work, this is kind of a common theme that comes up, is that students who come into the community college classroom are looking for answers. And what they're getting are descriptions of problems. And so this part of the class, we were about 6 weeks in, the class all kind of joined her in this idea that they were really tired of being labeled and they wanted to start to get solutions. So I asked, what could I possibly do uh, within the confines of the classroom? And she said, we don't know who's behind these stereotypes, who's behind these labeling systems, or how the legal system uses them. And we were talking about, a variety of different problems within the court system in that particular class. And so I started thinking about it from her point of view. First of all, why don't students know this? Um, it's self-evident, I think, to law and society scholars as we go through the process, which means that we've been removed from these early on experiences that people have when they're just starting to think about challenging dominance and challenging structural inequality. Um, but what I'd like you to think about is what are the differences that make a difference between my work and your work. Um, to my knowledge, I don't know of any other JDs who are community college professors. I haven't met one um, over the last 12 years. Uh, I think one thing that has been an interesting process for me was going back to the law and society literature and thinking about power again, but this time from the perspective of the powerless. And what I found in most of the literature is that power is being described from the point of view of the powerful, uh, oftentimes among people who, whether they realize it or not, hold some instrumental power at the very least. So I've been working through this project in the book chapter, um, with the feedback from our gracious editors about these methodological constraints. So part of the dilemma is really theorizing from the bottom up, but then trying to meet these scholarly literature review type assessments. So the first thing I kind of, there's a multitude of variables, and that's because Kingsborough students experience intersections of injustice that they don't always necessarily understand themselves. So while I appreciate the metaphor, I might try to challenge it. While I appreciate the metaphor of the spaghetti, or what, every time I see that way of thinking, it reminds me of the dust cloud from Peanuts, from Charles Schulz's cartoon. But I think our job is not just to document injustices or the messiness, but to try to structure ways of thinking that then lead to some kind of co-construction of a change in material conditions. And I'll get to that more, but I think that's the general kind of point of view that I'd like to bring to this conversation. So this is kind of the heart of the data. And so if we just think from just intersectional points of view, it's hard to decide where to begin in a community college classroom like Kingsborough. The obvious place for me was to interrogate this first figure up in the left-hand corner of this circle. The overwhelming percentage of tenured full professors are white, and yet students are not white using those same standards. And so there's a very clear dichotomy when you walk into a Kingsborough classroom, and up until about a year and a half ago, nobody wanted to talk about it. On the other hand, and I really appreciated when Corey brought this up, because it is a hard thing to talk about and a hard thing to explain, especially in a chapter. But most students actually don't operate or identify within that black-white dichotomy. Most of our students come from backgrounds that are multiracial, but they're also just a variety of experiences. So we have over 142 countries represented at any given time on the classroom, on the campus, and certainly in the classroom. There are a variety of languages, and it's a joy and a challenge to learn basically little bits of different languages each semester. And then there's a great deal of religious strife at our institution, and that is represented through student clubs and the Interfaith Forum trying to bring different groups together. So there's a wide variety of diversity among cultures and ethnicities. Then there's the gender and sexuality, I'd almost call it a gulf, where the female population at the institution is, the majority population. And yet there are a handful of student clubs that address gender and sexuality topics, and our only institutional capacity is something called Safe Zone, which does the best it can, but at most you're talking about 4 or 5 faculty members who maybe might meet with 20 to 30 students per semester. And then finally, the topic that most faculty want to talk about, and is certainly important, is the economic situation. Almost all of our students are under the poverty level and in some kind of emergency condition. It should not be surprising then that most of the students are first in their family to go to college. And I put pluses next to these two numbers because we don't have accurate data. We have largely guesses from federal data, but these are not things that students ordinarily, when they walk into the campus, want to say, this is my family background. Some of it comes from FAFSA, but I don't think I'm shocking anybody. Those forms are not always filled out with complete honesty. And so there's a lot of stuff missing here from the qualitative narrative that you just wouldn't find in the quantitative data. So I think, you know, most of my work is with other community college educators, and usually I'm doing workshops. So at this point in the presentation, we pause and then we break out into small groups and start to work through this enormous set of challenges. And one way that those of us who have started putting our heads together and trying to figure this out was just to break this down into simple questions. This is not so much something that could be simply just for students. This is mostly about how we can document what students are going through as we try to turn the corner from identifying injustice to activating some kind of engagement. And so these questions aren't necessarily linear, and they change from semester to semester, which is one challenge in sharing assignments, is that each semester I'm changing those assignments up based on the group that I have and based on the injustices and the real life challenges that they're going through in that moment. So this is, you know, as Michael McCann calls it, methodological jazz. These are the three dimensions of power that I'm most interested in as I'm working with students, what I share with students. And largely it's because students are coming into the classroom, and it sounds like most people, when I hear people talk about power, as if it were a thing, as if it were a reified object that I go to the store, I pay $2.55 for, and I take it with me. When we're thinking about overcoming injustice or hegemony in general, you know, that's very difficult then, because people start to think about how they're going to take power from somebody else or how they can get more power. So the way that we've tried to change that or get students to think about it differently is to start thinking about role power, or as some sociologists call it, relational power. And this has helped start to bring in the institutional processes, especially as we start to talk about injustice that occurs within the classroom, within the college experience, and more in street interactions. And it starts to help students move away from the theory of mind, where they're blaming intentions and motives on individual actors, to start to see the systemic processes. Now, we have not gotten to that systemic level with students yet. Each semester, I hope we're getting a little bit closer. I'll be pouring into that data over the summer to see whether we've gotten any closer at all. And this is largely because as students work through instrumental power and then institutional power, they're still struggling with the ideology, which to me makes perfect sense. And as I've gone through this process with them, they're constantly re-examining the assumptions that they had as they came into the classroom process. Now, I think that this is a helpful methodology because of two things. I think one, it really helps me untangle the spaghetti and then put it into a much more controlled process where then I can analyze the content. But I think it's also helpful for students because they start to see that law is not one thing. So my goal is that we would start to reimagine what in the West, or at least in the United States, we're constantly stuck within these Lockean parameters of freedom and order. And I've heard that throughout this conference. And so these are the meanings that students have reported so far. And I'm going to interpret them as being an ongoing process, and that this is, let's say this is at the 3/4 mark of the semester, where they start to share stories, they've shared their understanding of the materials, and they've reflected on the dialogues we've had in the classroom. So for them, rights is not a simple thing. It's a very complicated, complex model, and it's often rife with contradictions. But at the base, as we look at the word frequency or just the context, it's almost always about fairness. And then the rules of the game, they prefer to focus on the experience of that process. And here I'm mostly talking about Galanter's concepts. And they're not as interested in the info distribution. In other words, they don't want to know the roles and processes of the court. They want to experience those things. And that's much more practical and relevant, say, in a landlord eviction situation or in filling out paperwork for immigration. I will highlight that the contradiction that they're able to see of the limit of law is a wonderful learning outcome. It's a high point of the classroom experience, but it is not a high point from an activist point of view. Simply knowing that there are limits of law can be very depressing in the community organizing kind of world. But I think what's been most fascinating then is that they have shown what's called code meshing in educational language, that they know the narrative they're supposed to tell, but they don't really believe it. And so when I start to think about it from that point of view, it really struck me that we're kind of back into the same logics of the litigation going into Brown versus Board of Education. And so this has always been in my mind as I've gone through this and just collecting evidence. I think of Thurgood Marshall's request to his team is, how do we prove the harm? So one obvious place to start is that the teacher-student role is relational power. And so there's lots that can be analyzed just in that experience itself. That's where I would go to the bold and say, but that would be better suited for research university academics and the practitioners by coming into the classroom and working with us. This is not something that I'd be able to self-analyze as we go through the semester, at least not very well, I don't think. The other issue I think that I would push out to people is that LSA scholars from the literature I've reviewed are mostly looking at mobilized groups. They're not looking at demobilized groups. And so as I hear people talk about the backlash, about kind of the counter movement, I think this is where we need to be thinking is how do groups remobilize and how can we remobilize with them? Students are suspicious of the American dream, but they're at the community college to see maybe there's something to this. And so there's some danger in the liberal narrative. And then I think about trying to then construct a language of power from the point of view of the powerless. And then I'm hopeful for transformative moments. I guess I'd call myself a skeptical optimist. But the interactions that I'm having with students are just a very small fraction of their day-to-day life. And so what we've been trying to figure out over the last year and a half is how do we break through those silos and start to get out into the world with students. And so this has to be a fluid process. And so I put together this collage to kind of show two things. One is that it's fluid horizontally, that we're going from classroom to campus to the community and then back and forth again. But it's also...
I'm sorry, I'm just gonna, I don't know if you saw me, so about 2 more, if you could wrap up in about 2 more minutes, so we have...
The beauty is I've got 10 seconds, so...
oh no, okay, I'm sorry, Jason.
It's okay, it's the nature of the business. The issue here then is to think, so I'm gonna repeat that as we think about our differences, is that there's the horizontal, so there's going from the classroom to the campus to the community. And those are fluid, those aren't necessarily steps. But the other side of this is the biohistory, right? So I have a biohistory. I've been working with, little kids at some points in my life. I've been working with indigenous communities at other points in my life. I've been embedded in social movements, and I'm sure many of you are in that same category. But so are the people we're working with. They also have those biohistories. And I think one of the great things that this handbook has talked about is the generational knowledge that's passed down or shared with and shared across and among other actors. And so that's what I really want us to think about, is how our practices inform that process. And I'm done.